Logan emerged from the bunker into the partially ruined house that camouflaged the entrance and took a deep breath. The day was bright and clear. Sunbeams filtered through the dusty, occasionally shattered window panes, casting slanted light into the interior. The sun was already climbing high in the vividly blue sky. On days like this, the mechs were particularly sluggish, unless some reckless fool happened to wander too close. These days were the best for hunting. Mech sounds carried farther. Their movements were slower, and fire burned hotter than usual. Logan shook his head as if shaking off lingering thoughts and ducked back into the cool shadow of his hideout. A weathered, gray but sturdy bag was slung over his shoulder. He quickly strapped pouches with ammunition and first aid supplies to his belt, slid a worn pistol into his thigh holster, and after a thorough check, hoisted the flamethrower pack onto his shoulders. This was all secured over a long, ash-gray canvas cloak with wide hems and a large hood. His military boots had seen better days, but still held together, refusing to fall apart, despite their age. Logan set off toward the city with long, purposeful strides, pulling on fingerless tactical gloves and flipping the hood over his head. The sun blazed overhead, bringing out the sharp colors of the ruined city. The air shimmered above the cracked asphalt, almost painfully clear. A faint breeze from the east carried the salty tang of the sea. Logan considered that if this weather held for a few more days, he might head north to the river estuary to fish. Quietly, he crossed the street to the shadowed side and moved along the wall of a building, his steps deliberate and noiseless. This part of the city had fewer mechs. Most of them lingered closer to the port. The bridge over the bay had been destroyed long ago, and occasionally Logan could spot particularly large mechs on its southern edge. Few dared to venture near the port, and of those who tried, almost none returned. The rare survivors who did often lost their minds. Such feats of bravery weren't likely to inspire imitators. Logan moved westward, his ears tuned to every sound. Mechs were mostly silent when moving unless they engaged in direct combat. Occasionally, they emitted a faint grating chirp that made Logan wince. Other times it was a screeching, scraping sound interspersed with clear tones, or more rarely a loud guttural roar. These noises only occurred in the presence of people, though, so Logan remained focused on distinguishing between the rustles of mechs and the sounds of animals. Once, long ago, in the good times before the Crimson Night, this had been a bustling city teeming with life. Ships arrived regularly, bringing fish, fruit, oil, and countless other goods from across the globe. The massive port bustled day and night with activity. Now there were no ships, no connection to the outside world. What was once a vibrant city had been claimed by overgrown flora, creeping wildlife, and the relentless presence of the mechs. The skyscrapers were crumbling, their shattered windows reduced to shards crunching underfoot for the careless. Exposed structures were draped in creeping plants and moss, gray surfaces fading beneath encroaching green. Time and nature were dismantling the once proud city, transforming its solid buildings into heaps of rubble. Passing by a park, it was easy to imagine how mothers might have once strolled with their children along manicured paths, while old men played chess at shaded tables. That park, though, had become a dense and eerie forest. There were no mechs there, but no sane person would dare to enter it alone and unarmed, let alone bring a child. Rounding the corner of a building that was still relatively intact and only minimally overgrown, Logan froze, instantly pressing himself against the wall. His gray cloak blended with the concrete, rendering him nearly invisible. What he saw compelled him to stay put, his mind racing. A mech was climbing down the outer wall of a partially destroyed high-rise descending from the top floor. It wasn't large, roughly the size of a moose, but much more compact. Its black claw-like limbs gripped the jagged concrete, moving without so much as a whisper. Mechs were nothing if not efficient. They didn't scale buildings for no reason, and if this one was doing so, it could only mean it was hunting. And that meant there were people inside. If there were indeed people, likely scavengers, Logan knew he needed to leave before he became the target. Yet he hesitated, sniffing the air. People didn't live in these ruins. They came in vehicles, never venturing far without a quick means of escape. Logan had learned to avoid such places. Cars gave off the distinct scent of fuel, heated metal, and oil. Here, though, all he smelled was the salty tang of the sea, asphalt, and concrete. The mech vanished into a third-floor window while Logan debated whether to run toward the building or away from it. They don't set traps that high. A sudden realization struck him. Pushing off the wall, he shifted the flamethrower nozzle into a ready grip and bolted toward the gaping black entrance. His pace quickened as though spurred by a sixth sense. He leaped up the stairs, 2 or 3 at a time. There were people in the building, or rather, one person, a teenager. The sunny morning promised a sweltering day, making it easier to scavenge buildings for anything edible or useful. The girl had cautiously left her hideout after sitting by its narrow peephole for hours, listening to the faint rustle of wind and scurrying rodents. When the sun climbed higher, its heat pressing through the tiny gap, she took the risk of venturing out. Draping a sturdy piece of fabric over her shoulders to protect her skin from the sun, she slipped out onto the sidewalk, darting immediately into the shadows. The entrance to her hideout was a narrow crawl space that no mech could squeeze through, leading to the basement of a fully collapsed building, now just a mound of debris. Her hideout was barely big enough to sleep in and store a few supplies, and she had lined it with scraps of fabric for insulation against the bitter cold of winter drafts. She hated leaving the safety of her den, but had no choice. Food didn't find itself. The half-collapsed building she approached seemed unremarkable at first glance. But peering through a first-floor window, she saw a large open hall strewn with overturned round tables and chairs. Places like this often had entire storage rooms dedicated to food supplies. Canned goods, her most reliable source of sustenance, were often tucked away here, along with precious bottled water. Water was always an issue. If there were no bottles, she'd have to make the long trek north to fill up at the river. Rainwater and melted snow only made her thirst worse or caused burning sensations, so she avoided drinking them whenever possible. Constantly glancing over her shoulder, the girl crept toward the stairs. She crouched low as she climbed alongside the railing to the second floor. It looked just like the first, cluttered with overturned furniture. There was no treasure trove to be found here, only a massive kitchen with a rectangular hole in the wall that held 2 dangling ropes. Quietly and carefully, the girl ascended to the 3rd floor. Normally, she avoided going up that high. For one, most buildings were too unstable and could collapse at any moment. And for another, mechs often roamed the upper levels. Either way, the 3rd floor was too far from an exit, severely lowering her chances of survival in case something went wrong. But today was such a bright, lazy day, and this building seemed sturdy enough. She decided to take the risk. It was clearly the right call. The treasure trove was here. The stench of rot and mold had long since faded, leaving only dark stains on the shelves and floor to hint at the once fresh food stored here. But water and canned goods were still present, and there was a lot of it. Large jugs of water stood against the wall near the entrance, their size making it clear she wouldn't be able to haul even one back to her hideout. Rolling them out of the building would cause a commotion loud enough to draw even the laziest of mechs. And her hideout didn't have enough room to store them anyway. But further back, she found smaller bottles bundled together in plastic wrapping. Those she could manage. Beyond that, canned goods were stacked on wooden pallets, also wrapped in plastic, just like the water. Her heart leaped with excitement. She had stumbled upon a genuine stash. If she made 3 or 4 trips here today, she could stock up enough to avoid scavenging for weeks, safely hiding in her den. But at this moment, her thirst was unbearable. She hadn't realized how parched she was until she found herself staring at the water. The need to drink overwhelmed her usual caution. Pulling a knife from the layers of baggy fabric she wore, she punctured a large jug below the waterline and pressed her lips to the stream. She drank greedily, savoring every gulp, and didn't notice the first faint rustle of danger. Only after she'd quenched her thirst did her sense of vigilance return, but it was too late. A faint, wet, slapping noise echoed across the floor as something approached. Her body froze in place, praying it hadn't seen her. But then the black form emerged on the far side of the room. She sucked in a shaky breath and bolted for the stairs, her mind racing. Why had it appeared from the opposite side of the building? The mech's steps grew louder as it picked up speed. Its wet, slapping gait sounded disturbingly similar to her bare feet, though her steps carried a living, human cadence. She rounded the corner to the stairs and collided with something large, solid, and warm. She didn't have time to register what it was, only catching the faint glint of something yellow before she found herself alone on the staircase again. Without hesitation, she sprinted downward. Several steps later, she heard the unmistakable roar of flames, followed by a strangled growl and the sound of metal scraping against the floor. Then came the nauseating stench of burning flesh. A loud crash reverberated through the building, and then everything fell silent. Peeking cautiously from the staircase, she saw a tall man in a gray cloak crouched by the mech's fallen body, drawing a knife. She decided to wait until he left before sneaking back to take some water for herself. Logan barely managed to sidestep when a scruffy kid burst onto the staircase. She wasn't a scavenger, that much was clear, and he didn't sense anyone else nearby. Logan moved past her quickly and ascended to the next floor. He didn't need to look for the mech. It stood in the middle of the room, its head, or what passed for one, swiveling aimlessly. The creature had clearly lost sight of its prey. The mech didn't react to Logan's presence. It never did. He wasn't, after all, human. Taking another step forward, Logan aimed the nozzle of his flamethrower at the black mech-organic creature and pulled the trigger. The flame roared to life, engulfing the mech in an instant. It lunged toward him, but Logan snarled back, intensifying the fire. The acrid stench of burning flesh filled the air as the mech collapsed within seconds. It was immobilized, but not destroyed. Logan released the trigger, holstered the flamethrower's nozzle, and approached the smoldering carcass. Pulling a large combat knife from his bag, he worked quickly to disable its core before it could regenerate and grow new limbs. Finding the core was second nature by now, and it didn't take long to pierce it. Sparks flared briefly before dying out, leaving the mech's energy spent. As Logan dismantled the creature, harvesting its circuits, bolts, gears, and other usable parts, he occasionally felt the girl's gaze on his back. Eventually, she seemed to retreat, but he remained alert. Once he had reduced the mech to a pile of scorched organic matter, he tucked his tools back into his bag and stood. Only then did he notice the puddle on the floor beside a punctured water jug, along with the rest of the hoarded supplies. The canned goods didn't interest him, but the water was another story. "Looks like I came up with a fish on the hook," he muttered with a faint smile. Kneeling by the damaged jug, he tilted it to let the water flow directly into his mouth. It was slightly stale and warm, but clean enough, and certainly more portable than hauling a bucket around. Adjusting his grip, Logan hefted the full jug onto his shoulder. It was no heavier than a deer, and carrying it back to the bunker would be no trouble. He considered taking a pack of smaller bottles as well, but decided to keep one hand free. As he descended through the building, passing overturned furniture on the first floor, Logan didn't see the girl, but could still sense her presence. The hole in the jug was clearly her doing, and he guessed she was waiting for him to leave so she could take what she needed. Perhaps the canned goods, if she wasn't capable of hunting. Emerging into the bright sunlight, Logan shook his head slightly to adjust and set off toward the sea. He thought about heading straight home, but couldn't shake the faint trace of her scent. Deciding to meander through the streets for a while, he aimed to either lose the shadow trailing him or confirm there wasn't one. When the tall man reappeared, the girl froze. She had been watching the first-floor hall from under a table in the darkest corner, peering out through a hole in the thick tablecloth. She couldn't see his face. His massive hood obscured it, but she saw the water jug balanced on his shoulder, the very same one she had struggled to even budge. This man wasn't a mech, but he had taken one down. He was strong, and that meant safety. Water and her den were important, but the girl decided to follow him instead. She couldn't make sense of his movements. He wasn't running or making the sudden, erratic dashes she relied on to navigate the narrow streets. Instead, he walked soundlessly along the widest roads, even the broken glass failing to crunch under his boots. He seemed to be wandering in circles, as if searching for something, yet he didn't so much as glance around. Finally, he stopped in front of a building and turned toward it. A split second later, the man bolted in the opposite direction with almost inhuman speed. The girl, acting on instinct, mirrored his move, darting down a neighboring narrow street. After a few minutes of frantic running, an ear-splitting crash echoed behind her. She knew the sound well. It was a building collapsing. Pushing herself even harder, she sprinted as fast as her legs would carry her. Surviving took priority over finding that stranger again. But the stranger found her first, coming up from behind. He grabbed her around the waist, lifting her off the ground without breaking stride. She twisted her head just enough to see that the water jug was still balanced on his shoulder. Logan barely managed to get himself and his newfound tag-along far enough away to avoid the cloud of dust chasing them. Setting the jug down, he pulled out his pistol, shoved her face first onto the asphalt, twisted her arm behind her back, and pressed the barrel against the back of her head. "What do you want?" he barked, feeling foolish for even asking. The girl wriggled, trying to escape his grip, but froze when a sharp pain shot through her shoulder. "Don't make it worse for yourself," Logan growled. "Just tell me who sent you, and I'll make it quick." Instead of answering, she struggled harder, ignoring the pain. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, putting the gun away. With a sharp motion, he hauled her upright and turned her to face him, keeping a firm grip on her shoulders. "Where did you come from, and which idiot sent you?" She squirmed and bit his hand. Logan didn't even flinch, only shaking her lightly. She stared at him with wide, gray-green eyes, filled with a mix of fear and defiance. "To hell with this." "Get lost," he said, letting her go. "Tell whoever's watching me that I caught you and you lost me." but the girl stubbornly shook her head and stayed put. What? They'll kill you if you go back empty-handed? Logan frowned. She shook her head again, her face now wearing a strangely sorrowful expression. Wait, hold on, he sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose as a realization struck him. The girl still couldn't see his face, and his yellow eyes didn't seem to frighten her. You live here in the city, don't you? She flinched but nodded, averting her gaze. Got it. You clearly understand speech. Can you talk? She shook her head. I must be losing my mind, Logan muttered under his breath. Fine, let's see if I can get you back to some people. Name's Logan, by the way. Remember that, he said, hoisting the water jug onto his shoulder again. Now let's go, Mowgli. The tall man set off with the same soundless stride as before. This time, he seemed to take the most direct route to his hideout, but the girl quickly lost track of the streets and alleys. Logan didn't pause at each corner, didn't cling to the walls or stick to the shadows. He almost never stopped. She wasn't used to moving like this. Any turn could bring her face to face with a mech, a large animal, or something worse. The tall man didn't seem to care. Eventually, the towering buildings gave way to an area of single- and two-story houses. All of them looked abandoned and weathered by time. Grass had overtaken the lawns, forming thick, untamed patches. Along the wide street, rusted car shells rested on rotted tires, some overgrown with greenery and inhabited by small animals. The place seemed like no one had set foot here in decades. The girl constantly felt his gaze on her, even though he never once looked back. She stayed close to him, trying to find some measure of safety in his presence. Logan, for his part, walked with a steady, deliberate pace, as if following a familiar path. He turned off the street into a patch of overgrowth near a house that was just as abandoned and dilapidated as the rest. Cracked walkway stones, sprouted weeds, and the porch paint had peeled away, revealing weathered wood beneath. Sections of the railing were missing, as were planks from the floorboards. Logan walked up to the worn, slightly ajar door and slipped inside. The girl followed hesitantly. The interior was blanketed in thick layers of dust, with salt stains visible in some places. A half-rotten rug lay on the floor, its original color indiscernible from years of grime. Compared to this, her own hideout seemed downright cozy. At least it was clean. Logan moved deeper into the house, leaving no footprints as he stepped only on scattered scraps of carpet and dirty rags. The girl mimicked his steps carefully. Finally, he opened a creaky door, revealing a staircase leading downward. It wasn't very long, only 9 steps, before it ended at another door, this one metal and fitted with a wheel at its center. Logan set the water jug on the floor, gripped the wheel, and turned it with visible effort. Once the door opened, he picked up the jug, gestured for the girl to follow, and locked the door behind them. She realized there was no way she could open it on her own, and felt her chest tighten at the thought. They descended another short staircase, lit by dim red lights mounted at Logan's elbow height. It was just enough illumination to avoid tripping. At the bottom was yet another door, which Logan pushed open with his foot. The room they entered had gray walls lined with shelves and crates filled with tools. In the center stood a tall work table, suitable for standing tasks, and off to the side was a sturdy chair with a high back. Logan placed the water jug on the floor, removed the flamethrower pack from his shoulders, and set it carefully against the wall. He tossed his bag onto the work table, unstrapped his pouches and stowed them on a shelf, then draped his cloak over the chair before collapsing into it, tilting his head back. The girl stared at him, too frightened to move. Only now did she fully grasp that Logan wasn't human. His yellow eyes with vertical pupils belonged to a werewolf. His head, large triangular ears, muzzle, and long tail were covered in thick, soft fur. Fragments of half-remembered stories about creatures like him surfaced in her mind, and fear gripped her. She began to tremble and took a step back. "I don't eat people, and I'm far too tired to play chase," Logan said without looking at her. "I'll take you to some humans once you calm down a bit." The girl remained silent. She stopped backing away, though. Logan looked too exhausted and relaxed to pose any real threat. Logan himself felt drained. Her reaction was exactly what he expected: fear. People always reacted to him in one of two ways. Either they were terrified or they tried to kill him. Few could manage a conversation after seeing his ears and tail. He sat there for about 5 minutes, then stretched and stood up. His bunker didn't have many rooms, but there were more than enough to give her one of her own. At the moment, though, it was empty, so he figured he'd need to address that. The girl still stood frozen, watching him intently. Noticing this, Logan made an effort to move more smoothly and deliberately to appear less threatening. He walked to the door leading from the workshop to the kitchen, from which the other rooms were accessible. He wasn't particularly hungry, but he decided that finding furniture on an empty stomach wasn't ideal. Besides, food might help put the girl more at ease. In the entire city, Logan was practically the last person still using the gas utility. It was remarkable how mechs ignored buildings, but somehow maintained the infrastructure. That meant the bunker had electricity, gas, and running water, though the latter wasn't drinkable. When Logan first moved to this city, he hadn't expected such luxuries. He'd brought a diesel generator, though fuel for it had to be bartered from Thomas, to whom he sold mech parts. He used it sparingly, as the strong diesel smell irritated his sensitive, animalistic nose. Logan lit the gas burner and placed a small pot of water over the flame. He had vegetables and meat, a deer he'd killed a week ago. It wasn't the most tender meat, but beggars couldn't be choosers. He had already butchered and stored it in the fridge. He'd intended to make a stew, but hadn't gotten around to it, though he had some boiled brisket ready to use. He tossed that into the pot. His vegetables and fruits were dried, taking up less space and lasting longer. Logan considered himself lucky when it came to his mutation. He still had fingers. Yes, they were covered in fur with tough pads and claws, but they were dexterous enough for human tools. Cooking wasn't an issue. As the food began to emit a pleasant aroma, Logan heard the girl creeping toward the kitchen door. He knew exactly where she was hiding, just by the door, peeking through a narrow crack. When he was within her line of sight, she froze, seemingly holding her breath. When he moved out of view, she rustled and shifted. She was clearly hungry, but she wouldn't step into the room while she thought he was there. Finally, the soup was ready. Logan poured it into 2 bowls, placing one in her line of sight with a spoon beside it. Then he stepped back to the stove and stood where she could see him. He didn't want her to scald herself by diving into the hot soup too quickly. After a few moments, Logan moved toward the door leading to the corridor and deliberately opened and closed it, making it seem like he'd left. He then silently circled the kitchen and waited behind the wall near where she was hiding. For several minutes, there was only silence. The girl hesitated, peering into the room. Slowly, she grew bolder, pushing the door open a bit more each time to reveal more of the space. When she couldn't spot Logan, she crouched low and darted toward the table in quick, jerky movements. Logan quietly locked the door behind her and waited. He expected her to pick up the spoon, but instead, she clumsily knocked it off the table, grabbed the bowl with both hands, and buried her face in it. Logan's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected her desperation to be this severe. Shaking his head, he stepped around the table. His own bowl of soup sat there, and while his muzzle was certainly more suited to eating without utensils, he preferred using a spoon. The girl didn't notice him until she'd emptied her bowl. She raised her face, smeared with broth, and Logan spotted a piece of carrot stuck to her cheek. Startled, she jerked back, nearly tipping over the chair. She jumped off and bolted to the door, only to find it locked. Pressing herself against it, she panted heavily. "I'd say you're still hungry," Logan remarked. "Want more?" She shook her head sharply. Logan shrugged, stood, and began clearing the table, wiping it down as he went. He wasn't finished eating himself, but didn't like leaving a mess. The girl tracked his every movement, her gaze unblinking and still unmistakably hungry. Logan poured another bowl of soup, placed it on the table, and picked up the fallen spoon. He turned it over thoughtfully in his hands before placing it beside the bowl. Sitting back down, he ate a few spoonfuls of his own soup, then nodded toward her bowl. "Eat." This time she approached the table cautiously, as though expecting him to pounce at any moment. But Logan continued eating calmly, paying her no mind. Finally, she climbed onto a chair. Picking up the spoon, she turned it over in her hand, watched Logan use his, and then set it aside. This time, she drank the broth more carefully and only then began stuffing pieces of meat and vegetables into her mouth, swallowing without much chewing. "Yeah," Logan muttered. "Can't exactly take you to Thomas like this. And if anyone sees us, guess who they're calling the Beast?" He finished his meal and watched as the girl polished off her fourth and final bowl of soup. Final because there wasn't any left. He doubted she was fully satisfied, but her eating had slowed, and she'd stopped casting wary glances at him over the rim of the bowl. Logan leaned on the table, resting his muzzle on his intertwined fingers. Thoughts swirled in his head, making it impossible to focus. The girl was disrupting his routine in ways he hadn't anticipated, and he couldn't decide how to handle the situation. At least she could understand speech. Logan estimated she was around 12, which meant she was born before the Crimson Night, though she'd been too young to remember much of it. She hadn't known the good times. For her, the world had always been the way it was now. Logan wasn't much older than her, though. Before the Crimson Night, he hadn't been human either. By wolf standards, the end of the world had found him at the same age she was now. He didn't know what the world had been like before the Crimson Night. The only memories he carried from that time were two events: the day hunters killed his mother and the day Thomas found him. He also remembered the night itself, the night he became what he was. That evening, Logan had been playing with Luke, another wolf pup Thomas had taken in. They were the same age and usually just roughhoused, but things had gotten out of hand that time. Logan tore Luke's ear, and Luke scraped Logan's paw. Thomas had broken them apart by dousing them with water and took them both inside. The change began as Thomas was bandaging Logan's paw. Logan whimpered and pulled away, trying to escape the unpleasant sensation. Thomas spoke to him gently, but Logan's primitive mind could barely register the words. Then the world was overtaken by a veil. Later, Logan would learn it had been red, but at the time it was a blinding, terrifying haze. Soon after came the pain. It felt as though his body was being turned inside out. At first he howled and screamed, but his throat grew so raw that no sound could escape anymore. The only thing anchoring him to sanity was Thomas's voice. Logan had grown attached to the old man who had saved him. When Logan woke up, it was morning. Morning in an entirely new world. Over the last 10 years, most questions about that night had gone unanswered. What was the red veil? Why had only some humans and animals mutated? Why had so many not survived the transformation? Where had the mechs come from? No one even knew how many lives the Crimson Night had taken. What was clear was that within a year of that night, humanity's population had been reduced to a quarter of what it had been, largely due to mech attacks. For the first 5 years after the event, mutants like Logan were hunted until scientists proved they were just as intelligent as humans, and therefore deserved the same rights. But words and actions rarely aligned. Some people accepted mutants and could work with them, but most either feared or hated them, so mutants tended to avoid humans altogether. Logan was one of the few who could live in old cities infested with mechs, as the creatures ignored mutants entirely. This made mutants invaluable for studying mechs. They could hunt them and uncover their weaknesses more easily. Sometimes scavenger groups ventured into abandoned cities, searching for anything of value that hadn't already been taken. But aside from mech parts, little useful material remained, and hunting mechs was extremely dangerous for humans. People knew Logan lived in this city. Some still feared mutants and wanted them eradicated, while others sought a guide to help navigate the city. Logan wasn't interested in finding out who was who, so he stayed hidden. The only times he worked with people were on the rare occasions Thomas vouched for them. Even then, it was infrequent. The girl finally set down her bowl. She glanced at the pot again, but her gaze wasn't as hungry this time. Logan guessed she probably overate whenever she found food because she didn't know when she'd find it again. She might even eat past her limit out of desperation. Logan took a deep breath. "So, you've eaten almost all the soup I made. You probably won't answer. But how long has it been since you last ate?" The girl frowned, clearly concentrating, then held out her hands. She folded her thumb and ring finger on her right hand and her index finger on her left. Logan tilted his head, puzzled. "Huh. Wish I knew what that meant." The girl scowled, pushing her hands closer toward him, as if he hadn't seen them. It didn't make her answer any clearer, though, so Logan nodded as if accepting it. "All right." Logan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You understand what I'm saying, right?" She nodded. "But you can't talk?" She nodded, then shook her head, then tilted her head to the side. "Your tongue's intact?" Another nod. "Can you make sounds?" She gave a short nod, but her eyes suddenly filled with terror. She shrank into her chair, shaking her head. "Ah, I see," Logan said. "The mechs found your family because of the sounds, didn't they?" The girl nodded and curled into herself on the chair. "I'm sorry," Logan said softly. He stood and put his hands on his hips. There was no point in asking how long ago it had happened. Clearly, it hadn't been long enough for her to recover fully, but she'd been forced to learn how to survive on her own. Logan thought she was lucky to have run into him. Who knew how much longer she could have survived in a city swarming with mechs and frequented by scavengers. Logan had enough scars from humans to know more about cruelty than he cared to. He glanced around the kitchen and decided she needed a bath. She was filthy, and he seriously worried she might have fleas. Dealing with them in his thick fur was a nightmare. Every time Logan filled the tub, he silently thanked the mechs for maintaining the city's utilities. They even kept some buildings intact and sometimes gathered useful items in one place, usually while setting traps for humans. Logan took advantage of this when he wasn't forced to fight. The mechs ignored him entirely. Thanks to them, he had hot and cold running water. Not safe to drink, but perfectly fine for washing. Watching the slightly rusty water fill the tub, Logan thought about retrieving more of those large water jugs from the building. It wasn't far. He wouldn't even need an hour to get there and back if he didn't dawdle. He also considered letting the girl visit her old hideout. She might have something there that was precious to her. A clatter came from the kitchen, snapping him out of his thoughts. Logan rushed in to find the girl hiding behind an overturned chair, a pot lying on the floor near the stove. Logan slowed his pace, picked up the pot, and set it in the sink. A few drops of broth had spilled on the floor. He turned his gaze to the girl. She stared at him unblinkingly, as if expecting a mech to burst through the door at any moment. "No one's breaking in," Logan said with a sigh. "We're in a thick concrete bunker. It doesn't let sound out. And the only way in is the way we came. There aren't any mechs in the city small enough to fit, and even if there were, I could handle them. But..." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "I really don't like sudden noises. Sensitive hearing, you know. And I told you the soup was gone. You could have just sat and waited for me." The girl huddled tighter behind the chair, peeking out just enough to keep an eye on him. Logan exhaled deeply. She was afraid again, and now he had to figure out how to get her into the bath. He was starting to think he shouldn't have left her alone earlier. She could have seriously hurt herself. But the idea of taking her along, even just to fetch water, was out of the question. And there was no chance he'd take her to search for supplies in unexplored buildings or scavenge mech traps. Yet another adjustment to his life that didn't bring him any joy. "All right," Logan said, glancing at her again. He might have smiled, but his version of a smile, given his sharp teeth and wolfish muzzle, looked more like a snarl. "You need a bath. I think I've got some pants and a shirt that belong to Ethan, and maybe even some shoes. But first we need to scrape off that layer of grime. I'm guessing it's been a while since you cleaned yourself up." She nodded. Logan mentally chided himself. Of course she hadn't bathed in a long time. Where would she have done it? No one in their right mind would venture into the city full of mechs in the rain, since wet weather made them more active, forcing them to the surface. And the city near water always had more of them. She wouldn't have risked it just for the luxury of a bath. "You need a name?" Logan said, frowning thoughtfully. "Can't keep calling you Mowgli? How about Nora?" The girl tilted her head slightly, peeking further out from behind the chair as if mulling over the name. She kept her eyes locked on Logan, and he deliberately relaxed his posture. Something about her behavior faintly reminded him of himself during his early days with Thomas. Back then, he'd also been skittish and wary of everything around him, though he hadn't understood language yet. "Don't like it?" Logan asked, waiting what he thought was long enough for her to respond. She tilted her head the other way, seemingly unsure how to answer. "Does Nora work for you?" he rephrased, and she leaned a little further out and nodded. "All right then, Nora. Follow me." Logan led her to the bathroom, where another surprise awaited him. He had prepared a warm bath, enough to keep her comfortable but not so hot that it would burn him. But as soon as she saw the tub full of water, she bolted behind him, pressing herself against the wall. Logan frowned in confusion before it clicked. Mechs could hide near water or even in it. The water in the tub was cloudy, so she couldn't be sure there was nothing dangerous lurking beneath the surface. Repeating his earlier assurances about the bunker's safety seemed pointless, so Logan acted decisively. He grabbed her around the torso and plopped her into the bath. She screamed, a piercing, sudden sound that made Logan instinctively let go and pin his ears back. Without his support, Nora slipped and splashed into the water. She thrashed and shrieked, her eyes darting around wildly in panic. Logan winced but scooped her up by the ribs and shook her lightly. "Stop it," he growled. She immediately clamped her mouth shut, staring at him with wide, terrified eyes and panting heavily. Logan shook her again. "There are no mechs here," he said firmly, locking eyes with her. "Nothing's going to attack you. Understand?" She nodded slowly. Logan carefully set her down in the tub, then stepped back. Everything was soaked. Nora, Logan, and the bathroom. Logan was glad he hadn't brought the clean clothes or towels in yet. They would have been drenched. As water streamed off her skin and the filthy rags she wore, it turned brown with grime. Logan leaned down and pulled the plug, letting the dirty water drain away. Nora seemed to relax a little at that, and Logan turned on the shower head. Looking critically at the tattered cloth wrapped around her, Logan decided it was beyond saving. Extending his claws, he tore through the fabric with ease. Nora flinched, and Logan snorted as he met her gaze. Without a word, he grabbed a sponge and soap and set to work. Logan couldn't remember ever seeing so much dirt, not even when scrubbing his cloak after hunting in the swamps. While the water from the pipes wasn't exactly clean to begin with, what flowed off Nora made it look almost viscous. Finally, the ordeal was over, and Logan sighed in relief. He was drenched from head to toe, but at least Nora was clean, and he was reasonably sure she didn't have fleas. "Stay here," Logan said sternly. "Don't get out, and don't touch anything. Got it?" She nodded, and Logan left to fetch a towel. When Logan had first moved into the bunker, he'd hauled in a lot of supplies. One day, he'd come across a military clothing depot and practically cleared it out. Most of what he'd taken ended up with Thomas for sale, but he'd kept a few things. Sure enough, he found pants and a shirt small enough for Nora. Towels were easy to come by, but shoes were a different story. Returning to the bathroom, Logan turned off the shower and draped a towel over Nora, giving her shoulders a light rub. "Dry yourself off, get dressed, and head to the kitchen," he instructed. "You've soaked me completely, so I'm going to change." Nora nodded, and Logan left. The werewolf still scared her. She had been terrified when he pinned her down and pressed the pistol barrel to her head. But since then, he hadn't done anything truly frightening. Except for the bath, of course. She lingered in the tub for a few minutes until her legs started to feel chilly, then began drying herself off. She'd never done this before, but Logan's shoulder rub had shown her how it worked. In the past, whenever she got wet, she'd wrap herself in more dry rags and wait to dry naturally, which usually took a long time. The towel puzzled her at first. It had no holes for arms or a head. Then she noticed the clothes Logan had left for her. They were just like his, pants and a shirt. From what she could see, he didn't wear towels under his clothes. There was also a pair of short, elastic undergarments that clearly went on first. Logan didn't wear anything like that over his pants. Setting the towel aside, she dressed herself. The clothes were slightly too big but didn't fall off, and they were much more comfortable than the layers of rags she'd been wearing. The floor was wet from her earlier outburst, so the bottoms of the pants got damp as she stepped out. Not wanting to linger, she made her way to the kitchen, as Logan had instructed. She assumed it was the room where they'd eaten since she hadn't seen any others yet. She didn't dare sit in Logan's chair or upright the one she'd knocked over earlier. Instead, she tucked herself into a corner near the door, curling up. Compared to her old hideout, this room felt vast and intimidating, with ceilings much too high and too much empty space. Logan emerged from the door across from the bathroom, a bundle of clothes in his hands. He was now wearing dry pants and a shirt, identical to the ones he'd been wearing earlier. He headed into the bathroom, and soon the sound of splashing and rustling came from within as he cleaned up the mess. A few minutes later, Logan returned to the kitchen. He silently picked up the overturned chair and set it upright before sitting down on it. "Is there anything in your hideout you'd like to bring here?" he asked, resting his arms on the back of the chair and his muzzle on his hands. Nora nodded, then immediately shrank further into herself. "Well, it's late now." "We won't go anywhere today," Logan said. "If the weather stays like this, I'll fetch that water tomorrow. You can't drink what comes out of the tap, and I don't have any filters." Nora nodded again. He hadn't asked her a direct question, but it felt like he needed some sort of reaction from her, a sign that she understood him. "You've got a loud voice, I'll give you that," Logan added with a smirk. "Thought my ears were going to burst." She hid her face, embarrassed by his words, even though he hadn't meant to shame her. "With you around, all my plans have gone to hell," Logan remarked. "What are we going to do with you?" Nora shrugged and looked away. "Yeah, I don't know either," Logan sighed. "Maybe you should get some sleep, and I'll get some work done." She looked at him in confusion. Sleep felt dangerous. Then again, everything in the city had felt dangerous. "You can sleep safely here," Logan said, standing up. "I've told you that already. This place is secure. Come on." He led her down the corridor toward the rooms. On either side were doors leading to different spaces. Logan had taken the 2 rooms nearest the kitchen. One was his bedroom, the other a storage room. He'd occasionally stashed things in the other rooms, but nothing stayed there for long. Logan opened the door to an empty room and gestured for Nora to enter. He then returned to the storage room. While searching for clothes earlier, he'd come across a thick polyurethane mat and some sleeping bags. He'd planned to give them to Thomas, but kept postponing it because of their bulk. Logan grabbed the mat, a sleeping bag, and a coat. Unlike him, Nora didn't have fur to keep her warm. When he entered the room, Nora had already curled up in a corner and closed her eyes. "You'll freeze like that," Logan said, laying out the mat in another corner. "It's not too cold here, but sleeping on the floor isn't great. I'd rather not deal with you getting sick. Come on." He unrolled the sleeping bag and handed her the coat. Nora cautiously approached and took it from him. She slipped it over her shoulders and tied the sleeves together in front to keep the coat closed. Logan chuckled and untied the knot. "No, you put your arms in the sleeves," he said, guiding her hand into one sleeve. She managed the other sleeve herself, and Logan buttoned the coat for her. "I've got fur to keep me warm." "You don't," he said. "Now get in the bag and close your eyes. You need to rest." Under his watchful eye, Nora followed his instructions, crawling into the sleeping bag and closing her eyes. She didn't hear Logan leave, but as soon as she lay on the soft mat, she realized how exhausted she was. Sleep claimed her within minutes. Logan waited until she was sound asleep. He didn't want to risk her panicking or wandering around. He left the room and shut the door, deciding against locking it. He hoped she had enough sense not to wander around the bunker without him. There was work waiting for him in the workshop, so he headed there. For a moment he debated fetching another jug of water, but ultimately decided against it. As usual, he climbed to the house above the bunker, and his mood soured immediately. The moment he stepped into the corridor leading outside, he heard the sound of a vehicle. It wasn't on his street but 2 blocks away, and his sharp ears picked it up with ease. Going into the city under these conditions was a bad idea. Then again, it was debatable whether entering the city at this time was a good idea for anyone. Logan didn't suffer from any heroic delusions, so he had no intention of following to save whatever fools had driven into the city. The sound of the vehicle faded into the distance, and Logan returned to the bunker. Scavengers wouldn't stay more than 3 days, less if the weather turned. He could manage without any outings until then. In the workshop, Logan spread out the parts he'd salvaged from the mech. Technology built after the Crimson Night hadn't mutated, making it safe to handle. Moreover, once deactivated, mech parts became nothing more than components. The intricate circuits and boards were things humanity hadn't yet been able to recreate, so they were in high demand. Logan supplied them to Thomas, who sold them and in return bought vegetables, fuel, and various supplies for Logan. Technically, Logan could go to the market himself, but he preferred not to. Sorting through the components took almost an hour. Logan decided today's haul had been a success. He was tired, but with 3 days of downtime ahead, he'd have plenty of time to rest. And then there was Nora. Logan retreated to his room, lay on the bed, and stared at the ceiling. He had no idea where to start with humanizing her. As sleep overtook him, he thought it might be best to start small, maybe with a spoon. At least she wasn't afraid of that. Before the Crimson Night, Coriolis had been a cat. Adopted as a kitten, he'd spent the next 5 years living the ordinary life of a house cat. He ate, slept, sometimes ran wild at night, shed his long white fur all over the furniture, and allowed himself to be petted. Every 2 months, his owners took him to the vet, brushed him regularly, and even bathed him, a process Coriolis, surprisingly, enjoyed. The day before the Crimson Night, Coriolis, the cat, scratched his ear until it bled. Claire, his owner, had panicked when she saw his fur smeared with red. Her first instinct was to carry him to the bathroom to clean him up, which inadvertently hurt him. He responded with a small but deep scratch to her hand. Later they ate, and Coriolis curled up on the couch with his face toward the backrest, clearly expressing his displeasure. However, Claire managed to win him over by the end of the night, and he was soon nestled against her warm hip as she gently stroked his fur. And then it happened. Coriolis woke up alone in the apartment. Claire was nowhere to be found, and the place was in disarray. The cat was astonished to realize he could think and understand his surroundings in a way he hadn't before, but the vocabulary he recalled from his life as a pet wasn't enough to articulate his new awareness. Still, he managed to find food in the kitchen. For several days, life wasn't much different from before, aside from having the entire couch to himself and needing less sleep. But then the food ran out. Coriolis ventured outside only at night. A thin layer of snow had fallen, and the freezing temperatures made the world seem quieter. His white fur blended with the snow, giving him a sense of security. He thought he could find humans who would feed him in Claire's absence, or perhaps find Claire herself. But when he encountered humans, every instinct screamed at him to run. He barely escaped the hail of bullets that followed. Fleeing into a basement, he cowered, waiting for the humans to follow. But they never came. Something black attacked them instead. Coriolis learned quickly. He discovered that it was best to avoid humans entirely after seeing, through a small basement window, a group of them capture another cat like him, and shoot it without hesitation. He taught himself to hunt rats, but eating them raw proved unbearable. Watching humans from a distance, he learned to cook. Cooking, however, brought its own challenges. Smoke and scents could give him away. Eventually, Coriolis realized the city was nearly devoid of humans. He began exploring it at night to understand his territory and hunting grounds. Later, he ventured into the southern forest, where he hunted rabbits and grouse. 4 years passed this way, though Coriolis had little concept of time. One morning a steady drizzle began, weather that always brought out the black creatures. Coriolis, however, wasn't afraid of them. They paid him no attention. Humans, on the other hand, stayed indoors on such days. Coriolis headed into the forest, aiming to bring down a young deer. He crept carefully, and just as his prey lowered its head to graze, he pounced. The shot rang out simultaneously. Unable to change direction mid-leap, Coriolis landed on the deer's lifeless body, bracing himself to be the next target. He heard footsteps approaching and tensed, ready to bolt, and hoped the element of surprise might save him. But the figure crouched instead of attacking. "Hey, looks like you could use some help," a deep, gravelly voice said. "I can help you." Coriolis turned his head, nostrils flaring to catch the scent. The drizzle had masked it before, but now it was clear. This wasn't a human. It was another creature like him, altered by the same force. The stranger, his yellow eyes sharp and piercing, looked Coriolis over before tilting his head. "You grow up in the forest?" "Home," Coriolis answered, his voice still tinged with the feline softness of a meow. He surprised even himself by speaking. "Oh, sounds like it's been rough for you," the stranger said with a sigh. "Did you have a human with you?" Coriolis shook his head violently, the memory of senseless, brutal killings flashing through his mind. "You've had it even worse than me," the wolfman huffed. Rising to his feet, he extended a clawed hand to help Coriolis up. "You were a cat before all this, weren't you?" "I was a wolf. Name's Logan." "Coriolis," the cat said, his voice now carrying a low purr. "What?" Logan asked, clearly puzzled. "My name," Coriolis murmured, lowering his gaze. "Got it." "Coriolis," Logan said with a nod. "All right, come on. I'll help you however I can." Logan woke with a start, his sharp senses immediately detecting a faint human scent. Tensing, he quickly remembered the events of the previous day and relaxed slightly. Rising from bed, Logan went to check on Nora. She was curled up tightly in her sleeping bag, deeply asleep. Not wanting to wake her, he headed to the kitchen for breakfast. Tea brewed from dried herbs and stale biscuits weren't exactly gourmet, but Logan suspected the day would be taxing, and eating was a necessity. When Nora didn't show up, Logan decided to return to the workshop. The multi-channel radio he kept there needed to stay on, especially with humans in the city. While Logan wasn't inclined to help any would-be scavengers, it was useful to know when they left. Humans who ventured into the city typically used one of 3 channels to call for assistance, making them easy to monitor. Logan's personal channel was also active for anyone needing to contact him directly. Logan was finishing work on a salvaged circuit board when static on the radio gave way to a voice. "Black to white. Do you copy?" Logan stood and approached the radio, grabbing the transmitter just as the call repeated. "Black to white. Do you copy?" "White to black. I read you." "How far out?" Logan responded. "Black to white. Not far. I'm carrying weight, and you've got company. Should I come in?" "White to black." "Aware of the company," Logan said with a heavy sigh. "Any tales?" "Black to white. Just the unavoidable kind. They didn't see me." "Over. White to black. Make sure it's clear, then come in." "Over," Logan replied, doubting the wisdom of his own decision. "Black to white. Understood. On my way. Out." Logan set down the transmitter and quickly cleared his workbench. Coriolis had never been one to snoop or steal, but Logan didn't like meeting visitors in a cluttered space, especially given the current circumstances. Logan not only managed to clear off his workbench, but also paced the room a few times before a soft scratching came from the door. The werewolf turned the locking wheel and opened it. Standing on the bottom step was a mutant cat, his fur-covered head uncovered as he had already pushed back his hood. A deer carcass was slung over Coriolis's shoulder. Logan stepped aside to let him in and promptly secured the door again. "Hey," the cat nodded in greeting. "This is from the wolves. They said it's for something you helped them with." "Huh?" Logan frowned momentarily in confusion before nodding. Oh, right. Pulled a wolf out of a trap. Good timing, too. Is it because of the humans in the city? Coriolis asked, lowering the deer to the floor and removing his cloak. They'll be leaving today. No. Not because of them. Logan shook his head. How do you know they're leaving? I was planning to pass through some of the more mech-infested parts of the city. Places humans usually avoid. Coriolis shrugged. Caught a whiff of gasoline, so I got closer. Figured no one sane would go there without you. Looks like they were trying to loot a mech stash but got caught. From what I could tell, there were 8 of them. 1 got eaten, 2 are injured. Now they're figuring out what to do. They can't leave without treating the wounded. But if they stay too long, they'll all get torn apart. Their own fault, Logan replied indifferently. You're really not going to help them? Coriolis asked skeptically. I wouldn't risk it alone, but the 2 of us could manage. I've got a situation here, Logan began, but he was interrupted by a loud crash from the kitchen. The cat immediately drew his pistol and moved toward the door, his movements swift and fluid. He knew mechs couldn't infiltrate the bunker and wouldn't even attempt to. Only humans could cause such commotion. Logan, however, shook his head and strolled toward the door without the slightest urgency. He opened it to reveal a broken mug lying in pieces on the floor, a remnant of his earlier breakfast. In the far corner, huddled behind a chair, was Nora. You're still safe, Logan said calmly, retrieving a broom and dustpan. Though breaking dishes isn't great, they're not exactly easy to replace. Come out of there. Nora complied, pushing the chair aside but remaining hesitant to leave the corner. Meanwhile, Logan swept up the shards and tossed them into the trash. He then set a kettle on the stove. Come on in, Logan called to the cat, shortening his name. And bring the deer. The moment Coriolis entered the kitchen, he froze, his sharp gaze locking onto the girl. He dropped the deer's legs from his grip, crouched slightly, and hissed. Calm down, Logan said with a sigh, stepping between them. She's just a kid. Found her in the city yesterday. No idea how long she's been out there on her own. But leaving her behind would have been as good as throwing her to the mechs. Fair point, Coriolis replied, his greenish-yellow eyes still fixed on her. Why not hand her over to the humans? In this state? Logan scoffed. You think they're only cruel to people like us? You're right, Coriolis muttered, his tone briefly slipping into a purring growl, a habit he rarely allowed himself, as it immediately marked him as a mutant. All right. I can stick around for a bit and help. You think she can't be left alone? I don't know, Logan admitted. The kettle whistled and Logan poured hot water into cups, quickly diluting it with cold since neither he nor Coriolis could tolerate overly hot drinks. He grabbed a pack of hard biscuits, pouring them into a steel bowl and placing it in the center of the table. The wolf and cat settled on one side of the table, while Nora finally emerged from her corner. She approached cautiously and climbed onto a chair without fully straightening. She sniffed the tea and gently pushed the cup away, her careful movements catching Logan's attention. From her actions, Logan realized she must have sniffed her earlier cup the same way before accidentally knocking it off the table. Nora reached for the biscuits, grabbing one and biting into it. Bland and cardboard-like to most, the biscuits seemed to please her greatly. Within moments, she was kneeling on the chair, her face buried in the bowl as she devoured them hungrily. Well, that's something, Coriolis remarked. Says the cat? Logan snorted. Hey, the feline protested. Before I turned into this, I was a house cat. Eating like that was perfectly normal for me. And we don't know what normal was for her, or if she even had one, Logan sighed. You know humans rarely stay in ruined cities. From what I gathered, her family was eaten. And in some ways, her situation's worse than yours. She doesn't speak. But she understands? Coriolis asked, earning a nod from Logan. You planning to take her to Thomas eventually? I would have taken her straight to him, but you know as well as I do, he's not young anymore. It'd be too much for him, Logan replied, shaking his head. Want a biscuit? Not really, Coriolis shrugged. I ate before I left. Didn't expect to run into the wolves, huh? Logan smirked. You know I prefer moving around at night. Coriolis shrugged again. So, are we going on this rescue mission or not? Nora, Logan called, his tone firm but not unkind. The girl flinched, a biscuit clamped between her teeth. She growled quietly, scooting to the edge of the table. We'll take you back to your hideout, Logan continued. You'll wait there while we take care of something, all right? Her expression softened, though she tilted her head questioningly. This is my friend Coriolis. Logan introduced the mutant cat, gesturing toward him. We've got some business to handle, and we can't take you with us. Leaving you here isn't a great idea either. How about staying in your old hideout while we're gone? You can gather your things while you're there. Nora nodded and slid down from her chair. The dry biscuits had made her thirsty, and she scanned the kitchen for something to drink. Picking up her cup again, she sniffed it, wrinkled her nose, and hesitated before taking a cautious sip. Then, in one swift motion, she gulped down the tea. I'll stash the deer carcass in the cold room so it doesn't spoil and grab a couple of med kits, Logan said, standing up. Cat, get dressed and armed. Nora, stay put and don't touch anything. By late morning, they had left the house and crossed a few blocks quickly. Nora led them through narrow paths to the building with the semi-basement where her hideout was located. She demonstrated a knock on her palm, 2 taps, then 3 measured ones, and finally 3 rapid taps. Logan nodded approvingly, keeping silent. Talking out in the open, especially with a human nearby, wasn't the best idea. After leaving the girl in her hideout, Logan trusted her fear would keep her safely hidden. The 2 mutants made their way to the city's waterfront district. The rising heat made the mechs slower, though they spotted several inert mech bodies closer to the water. Coriolis led Logan to a low stone building with battered, closed gates. The smell of gasoline and blood wafted through the cracks. Logan sniffed the air and snorted. They circled the building, finding a broken window near the roofline. Coriolis climbed in first, followed by Logan. They moved so quietly that the humans scurrying around the vehicles didn't even notice them. The cat and wolf approached openly, making no effort to hide. Behind one of the trucks, 2 injured humans lay on fold-out cots, a man and a woman. The man was unconscious, his left arm missing, and the wound hastily wrapped in blood-soaked rags. Sweat beaded on his pale forehead, but he was still breathing. The woman was awake, groaning hoarsely as her unnaturally bent leg oozed through poorly applied bandages. Logan handed Coriolis one of the medkits and moved toward the woman, shoving one of her companions aside. "Back off, or I'll shoot," the man barked, stepping forward aggressively. "Go ahead, shout louder," Logan said quietly. "Then we'll all die." "Freak!" the man spat, but took a step back, lowering his voice. "Look in the mirror," Coriolis growled. "We're here to help you get out of here before the weather turns." "And it will turn soon," Logan added. "If you want to live, stand still and don't move." Logan tore away the bloodied rags and carefully ripped the fabric of the woman's pants to reveal her injury. It was an open femur fracture. The bone protruded through the skin. Logan retrieved an anesthetic from the medkit, injecting it above the wound. He then cleaned his claws, donned rubber gloves, and offered the woman a wooden stick. "I've numbed it, but it's still going to hurt," Logan said bluntly. "Bite down on this. We don't need you screaming." The woman nodded, clamping the stick between her teeth. Logan worked quickly but meticulously, realigning the broken bones as carefully as possible without causing further damage. Blood didn't gush out, which was a good sign. He sewed the wound closed and cleaned it with a piece of gauze. Spotting some pieces of rebar nearby, Logan fashioned an impromptu splint, securing it with bandages. He removed the stick from the woman's mouth. "Better?" Logan asked curtly. She nodded, her face pale but resolute. Logan handed a few painkillers to another man who stood nearby. "These will help with the pain. No more than 3 a day. I suggest you drive slowly and carefully," Logan advised. "Leave the whole medkit," the man demanded sharply. "You done?" Logan asked, glancing at Coriolis over his shoulder. "Yeah, we're good to go," the cat replied. "Leave the medkit," the man repeated, raising his voice. "Or I'll have to shoot, and as you said, noise will kill us all." "Correction," Coriolis interjected, his tone dripping with menace. "It'll kill all of you. Let them go," the woman said suddenly, her voice weak but firm. "They didn't have to come help us. They could have left us to die. Either Ethan and I go alone, or we all do." "You idiot," the man hissed. "That medkit is worth a fortune." "Think about how much we could make. I'm with Sarah," another voice chimed in from behind one of the vehicles. "A one-time profit is fine, but if no one helps us next time, it'll be our fault." "They're mutants," the man spat venomously. "Of course they are. Humans wouldn't have come here," the second voice replied evenly. "Mutants should be killed," the first man snarled, raising his pistol at Logan. In an instant, Logan was behind him, a knife pressed to his throat. "If you'd behaved," Logan growled through clenched teeth, "I might have shown you a safer route out of here, or even brought you more supplies from the mech stash. But now, you can dig yourselves out of this mess." Logan shoved the man to the ground and disappeared with Coriolis before he could regain his footing. The man stood, cursing under his breath. Despite his rage, he ordered the group to load up and leave, knowing full well they wouldn't survive another encounter with mechs. From the neighboring building, Logan and Coriolis watched the humans drive off, ensuring they wouldn't be followed. As the sound of engines sliced through the silence of the city, a mech stirred somewhere inside a nearby building but didn't venture outside. Only when the vehicles had disappeared into the distance did Logan and Coriolis step out onto the streets. "And this is exactly why I hate helping humans," Logan muttered, his voice tinged with irritation. "I completely understand your reasons," Coriolis replied evenly. "But you know why it's necessary sometimes." "I'm starting to doubt it's necessary at all," Logan sighed. "Let's go. I found some water nearby. Might as well grab a couple of bottles. Lead the way. Though by evening it might rain," the cat added, glancing at the heavy sky. "What of it?" Logan shrugged dismissively. "Not much for us," Coriolis smirked. "But for your new protégé, it might mean quite a lot. We'll make it in time." Logan sighed again, striding purposefully toward the quieter parts of the city. Nora's meager belongings fit neatly into a small bundle wrapped in a dirty cloth. As she packed them, she noticed with some surprise how much her makeshift rags now repulsed her, and how cramped and unpleasant her old hideout suddenly felt. Logan's home still intimidated her with its size, but it was a place where she felt safe. A stark contrast to the suffocating ruins she had known. Still, she waited patiently, partly because Logan had told her to, and partly out of fear of running into a mech on her own. When she finally heard the familiar knock, she scrambled to the entrance and found Logan with his feline companion. His name was too complex for her to remember, but she liked him for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. Despite her lingering fear, She felt an inexplicable urge to touch his long white fur. An urge she didn't feel toward Logan, though it wasn't out of fear. The group walked in silence, avoiding the main streets and cutting through alleys and narrow pathways. Nora didn't understand why they had taken a different route, but she preferred it. The dark, confined spaces felt safer to her than the open, exposed roads. By the time they reached the bunker, the sun was dipping lower in the sky. A breeze picked up, carrying the scent of rain. The first droplets fell just as they reached the pathway leading to the house that concealed the entrance. "Sooner than I expected," Coriolis remarked, glancing at the sky. "But we made it," Logan said, unconcerned. "Let's get the deer dressed and stored before it spoils." As the rain turned into a fine drizzle and eventually faded away, the bunker settled into its usual quiet. The warm light from an old lamp bathed the room, and dust particles hung motionless in the still air. Outside, the night was silent and heavy. Nora shifted her weight from one foot to the other, holding a small spoon in her hand. It was clear she still didn't entirely understand how to use it, and the very idea of food being readily available, without a fight or a chase, seemed to baffle her. Logan didn't rush her. Sitting at his workbench, he hummed a soft tune to himself, a melody he vaguely remembered from a long-lost time. His hands moved deftly over a small mechanism salvaged from a mech, though he wasn't entirely focused on his task. Nora occasionally glanced at him, her eyes no longer brimming with fear, but rather a cautious curiosity and, for the first time, a faint glimmer of hope. By morning, the city lay beneath a light veil of mist. Logan handed Nora a sturdy windbreaker. It was far too large for her, but to her, it wasn't just an ill-fitting garment. It was clothing, something she hadn't had before. She buried her face in the collar, shyly taking in her surroundings. For the next few days, Logan taught her practical survival skills. He showed her how to start a fire quietly, how to sharpen a knife without making noise, and how to choose the warmest, safest spot in a room. He even taught her how to use a spoon, how not to burn her tongue on hot soup or let a biscuit slip to the floor. At first, Nora still ate with her hands, but each meal brought a little more progress. She began to hold his gaze longer, and one day she even attempted to mimic a sound he made. Not a word, but a soft, raspy whisper. Logan noticed and gave her a quiet nod, acknowledging her effort without overwhelming her. 3 days after Coriolis's departure, Logan decided it was time to move. The weather was warm again, and the mechs were sluggish, hiding in shadows and barely stirring. Logan led Nora along hidden paths, pointing out places to hide if necessary, and marking locations where the food had long since rotted away. The city gave way to semi-collapsed fences and narrow lanes, and soon they reached a safe zone. A temporary trading outpost stood there, populated by merchants and scavengers. Thomas, who hadn't changed much over the years, sat in his usual spot on a bench beneath an awning. When he saw Logan approach, his eyebrows rose in surprise. Then he noticed Nora and stood, his expression shifting to one of restrained astonishment. "Found her in the city," Logan explained quietly. "Pulled her out right under the mech's noses. She doesn't speak but understands well enough. I was hoping you could take her in before the weather turns for the worse. I'll visit, bring supplies, whatever's needed. She just needs to be around people to learn how to live without fear." Thomas studied the girl for a moment before offering a warm, tired smile. His outstretched hand didn't frighten her. Nora hesitated, retreating half a step but not fleeing entirely. It was a good sign. "She'll stay with me," Thomas said, nodding. "We'll sort things out, Logan. Don't worry." Logan exhaled heavily, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Nora clutched her oversized windbreaker tightly, as if trying to draw strength from its fabric. Thomas's voice was calm, and his scent, free of blood, rust, and metal, was comforting. The air here smelled of campfire smoke, dried herbs, and distant roads, a mix of past tranquility and the promise of a brighter future. Logan reached out, lightly touching Nora's shoulder. She turned to look at him and for the first time tried to smile. It was awkward, but genuine. She then glanced back at Thomas, slowly accepting the new reality where she didn't have to be constantly on guard. Logan nodded, his tail swaying slightly. By the time he left the trading post, the sun was high, painting the sky in soft, golden hues. As Logan walked back to his bunker, a rare sense of peace settled over him. Behind him was a vast, complicated world where humans, mutants, and mechs struggled to coexist. And within that world was Nora, a girl who would learn to speak again, eat with a spoon, trust people, and perhaps one day share the story of the wolf who saved her from the ruins and brought her back to life among humans.